Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all from wherever you're joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today at the launch of our book, Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. I'm joined with these esteemed contributors to the book and panelists, and also my co-editors, Matt Mahmoudi and Coline Schupfer. We just wanted to again, thank you all, and thanks to Haymarket and the panelists. We're joined today by the moderator, Professor Ruha Benjamin, who is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and the founding director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab. We're also joined by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is an abolitionist and a teacher at the City University of New York Graduate Center. We're joined by Juan Carlos Lara Galvez, who's a Latin American activist at Derechos Digitales, and also with Marwa Fatafta, who is a Palestinian digital rights researcher and policy director at Access Now. So just to let you know the format for this event, Ruha Benjamin is going to give us a brief intro. Then we're going to have a 45-minute conversation with the panelists, and then a opportunity for some question and answer from the audience. If you can put your questions in the comment, we will be sure to see them, and we look forward to this event with you all. Thank you. Turning it over to Ruha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I think we're in for a really lively conversation, and I'll get us started. Horrible, shocking, heartbreaking. So were some of the reactions to photographs and videos showing U.S. Border Patrol corralling Haitian migrants attempting to cross the Rio Grande into the U.S. in September 2021. The agents straddled horses, wielding whips, shouting expletives, in scenes that seemed to evoke a prior era of racial slavery. Social media erupted with charges of racism at the routine dehumanization of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous migrants, a stark contrast to the border crossers coming into the country from Canada or those entering the country by plane, including the recent arrival of Ukrainian refugees at the time. One group is being met with food, cheers, places to live, which is what welcoming looks like. And the other group is being met with cowboys with leather straps or ropes and detention by force, said Nana Gyamfi, the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants and executive director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration. On Instagram, I scrolled past vintage drawings of slave catchers in the 1800s that were juxtaposed with this recent footage of US Border Patrol agents hovering over the drenched bodies of families carrying their belongings in trash bags. Scrolling further, one friend of mine posted a video of Joe Biden in a 1994 PBS interview with Charlie Rose, with Biden saying, "If Haiti just quietly sunk into the Caribbean or rose 300 feet into the air, it wouldn't matter a whole lot in terms of our interests, our interests." Another friend posted the words of poet Warsan Shire. "You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land," floating above the image of a girl clinging to her father as he waded through the water. The Biden administration knows the land is unsafe for those in Haiti. It acknowledged the dire conditions in the country earlier in the year when the administration announced that Haitians already living in the US were eligible for temporary protected status, but new arrivals seeking asylum need not apply. Instead, the administration proceeded to expel migrants crossing from Mexico, many of whom had been residing in South America since the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, deporting them to a country now experiencing political violence and ongoing humanitarian disasters. According to Allison Parker, US Managing Director of Human Rights Watch at the time, the US government showed a total disregard for the right to seek asylum when it sent agents on horseback with reins flailing to control and deter this largely Black migrant population. The violent treatment of Haitians at the border, she said, is just the latest example of racially discriminatory, abusive, and illegal US border policies. But it's not simply border agents on horseback that make the scene violent. It's borders, period. Or as Aisha Siddiqui so incisively states, every border implies the violence required to maintain it. They do so by limiting people's mobility and by punishing those who actively challenge the border regime. Likewise, according to political geographer Rhys Jones, by refusing to abide by a wall, map, property line, identity document, or legal regime, mobile people upset the state's schemes of exclusion, control, and violence. They do this simply by moving. And in upsetting the state, mobile people become targets for repression. The violence visited upon people of Haitian descent in the US-Mexico borderlands in September 2021 is only one manifestation of such repression. This high-profile spectacle of border violence against Haitian migrants captured widespread attention, perhaps because it falls on the most obvious end of a carceral continuum that seeks to contain racialized populations in the name of public safety and public health. But what of the more insidious end of the spectrum, the end that appears nonviolent, but effectively does most, if not all, the same work as the overtly violent? Consider this example. The Dominican Republic now employs a digital ID system that provides people with proof that they're Dominican citizens. As discussed in many of the essays and case studies in the volume that were gathered here to launch, states laud such technologies as a more effective way to ensure citizens get access to public goods and services. Encouraged by the World Bank and the UN, many countries have taken similar steps as that of the Dominican Republic in the name of fighting structural forms of exclusion and marginalization. However, this techno fix, it turns out, has an ugly underside. The Dominican state has effectively weaponized the ID system to discriminate against people of Haitian descent living within the country. It's done so by blocking the Haitian descended population from accessing and renewing their IDs. Such practices build upon a history of horrific racialized and nationalized violence by the Dominican state against people of Haitian descent, coupled with the long-standing exploitation of that population for reasons of economic and political gain. This demonstrates a point made by Special Rapporteur E. Tendai Achume in a November 22 report prepared for the UN General Assembly. Achume notes that many of the emerging digital technologies employed in immigration and border policing have historical antecedents in colonial technologies of racialized governance. This speaks to how not only is technology not neutral, but its design and use typically reinforce dominant social, political, and economic trends. Indeed, the report finds that national governments employ these technologies in ways that advance the xenophobic and racially discriminatory technologies that have become so prevalent, in part due to widespread perceptions of refugees and migrants as threats to national security. It's also a manifestation of what I've called the new Jim Code, the employment of technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. A 2015 audit of California's gang database reveals a very different reality. That's just one example. This audit found that Black and Latinx individuals constituted 87% of those listed in the gang database. Moreover, the names turned out to be babies under the age of 1, some of whom were supposedly self-described gang members. So far, no one has explained how this could have happened except by saying that some combination of zip codes and racially coded names constitute a risk. Such outcomes raise serious questions about what it means to deploy supposedly neutral technologies in a context that embodies an unjust set of social relations. Innocence and criminality are not objective states of being that an algorithm can detect, but are created through the interaction between technology and a deeply racialized history, in which certain types of people are coded as criminal. Once someone is added to this database, whether they know they're listed or not, they undergo even more surveillance and lose a number of rights. Inclusion in this context is more akin to possession, as in Frantz Fanon's plea that the tool never possessed the man. The goal is thus not simply to tweak these technologies to make them, quote, less biased, as this simply enables them to better carry out the racially discriminatory violence mandated by an already racist, white supremacist, xenophobic state. The goal must instead be to address the socio-political and economic conditions that give rise to injustice and surveillance in the first place. The task of this volume then is to connect obvious forms of harm and discrimination with more insidious technologies, immigrant databases, digital IDs, electronic tracking systems, to name a few. Because for all the talk of smart borders, which use the latest in facial recognition, aerial drones, data fusion centers, borders are just becoming more sophisticated sites of racialized surveillance, displacement, and death. Here we have to understand smartness as the ability to more efficiently categorize desirables from undesirables, rich from poor, expat from migrant and refugee, and capital from labor. Today, these technologies are used to determine everything from who gets access to safe harbor in a new country, welfare services, shelter, to who is booked or released from prison, who's targeted and persecuted for exercising their right to protest. This volume, like the flood of images depicting Haitian migrants determined to find refuge, holds a mirror up to the everyday violence of borders that rarely capture widespread public attention, much less outrage. The essays and case studies draw our attention to the policies and technologies that governments and companies are deploying quietly and viciously, tearing into people's lives, ripping families apart, hunting down the most vulnerable, one computer bit at a time. The power of these technologies rests on a false assertion of neutrality. They count on us believing that they're more objective, even more humanitarian than a scowling border agent wielding a whip. But there are many types of violence, some spectacular and swift, others quiet and methodical. One example is the executive order that President Biden signed on January 20th, 2021, his first day in office. The presidential directive ordered the pausing of construction of Trump's southern border wall. On the same day, the White House sent a bill to Congress, the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, calling for the deployment of, quote, smart technology to manage and secure the southern border. The US and EU employ a wide array of technologies to surveil and patrol land and sea and to determine, by way of algorithms, who can and cannot cross its borders. A digital fortress has been layered upon imperial projects already built on an underbelly of white supremacy and global apartheid. Concrete brutality has been exchanged for covert brutality. The deployment of smart borders against migrants out there then offers up new tools for patrolling racialized individuals via smart cities in here, those social borders within the nation state that carve up our neighborhoods, our schools and institutions, structuring access to resources and letting us know where we belong and where we do not belong. The power of the new Jim Code is that it allows racist habits and logics to enter through the back door of tech design, in which humans who create the algorithms are hidden from view. We need abolitionist tools that counter these tech-mediated forms of violence, anti-Blackness in the US, and that help us put an end to the policies and technologies that governments and companies are deploying quietly and viciously, technologies that tear into people's lives. If the coronavirus pandemic has taught us anything, it's that borders are a futile and outmoded tool for keeping us safe, that humanity is inextricably connected, both biologically and spiritually, and that any way forward has to safeguard the well-being of everyone, not just those with the right passports. This involves employing creative tools to subvert the racist status quo and not only critiquing the world as it is, but reimagining it for what it could be. This volume invites us to question and organize against high-tech border imperialism globally, particularly in a time of unparalleled inequality across the world and myriad challenges on both the ecological and epidemiological fronts, even as we imagine a world without borders. With that, let's begin our conversation. I will start by inviting the editors of this volume into the frame, and then we'll turn to several of our esteemed contributors. For the editors, Coline, Matt, Mizue, you all met while working across different contexts, but realizing you're essentially up against the same machinery in different guises. Could you just share with us a little of the backstory in terms of how your paths crossed and how this volume emerged?
So I was working in a legal clinic in Moria refugee camp in Lesbos, which is one of the frontline Greek islands receiving refugees via the treacherous sea route that connects Turkey with Greece. It was then that I joined the Justice Initiative in London with a lot of open questions about the role of technology in migration control. And at the Justice Initiative, a colleague of mine, Matthew Burnett, who works on people power justice, and he was also a really great mentor of mine, introduced me to Matt and Mizue, who were already thinking about and tackling these questions around tech, around securitization, and the impact and role of these systems and these technologies that were being trialed and tested in places like Moria refugee camp.
I can jump in here to continue on. Coline, moving on from you being connected to us, sort of taking a step back to where I first ran into Mizue, who was really the instigator of bringing this assemblage of people together, as it were. So I was looking at smart city projects and digital initiatives geared towards refugee and migrant communities at large in particular. I was interested in the ways in which both migrant and migrant labeled environments and bodies were being instrumentalized for tech interventions in their names being delivered ostensibly under the guise of helping them integrate, helping them access services. But it was clear that the sort of same experimentalism with technology that we'd seen happen with tech initiatives, including, for example, blockchain-based digital ID initiatives, community Wi-Fi, automated decision-making, that was being deployed in refugee camps experimentally and to great harm, were being ported back into the city, right? And in particular, I was working at the time on Berlin and New York, and it was evident that the same big tech companies and predatory startups that were backed by them were behind the experiences that refugees were having elsewhere. But we're enabling the camp to endure beyond the camp, creeping it closer to our bodies and our environments in our cities. And I reached out to Mizue because I was, at the time, trying to understand the relationship between the US immigration customs enforcement raids that were happening in New York City and the placement of smart city infrastructure in particular. And I was worried about how Link NYC, which is a public Wi-Fi initiative, that's owned and operated by an alphabet company, and the IDNYC system were seemingly correlated with some of the increasing rates that we were seeing in around 2018 and 2019. And Mizue had answered this question in part by working on the map that brought out where the raids were happening across New York City and made it possible to actually gauge how were they placed vis-a-vis some of the digital urban infrastructures that I was interested in, and realizing that Mizue and I at the time were sort of up against the same beast in different ways. But why don't I pass over to Mizue to bring this all together?
Thanks, Matt and Coline. So I had met Matt over email at a time, I think it was like the second year of the Trump administration. And it was a time where I don't need to explain what it was like to be a immigrant rights or migrant justice advocate, but it was also following, years of the Obama years of unprecedented levels of mass deportation, and then prior to that, the same with George Bush, who founded the Department of Homeland Security. And so when I had met Matt, I was working at the time at an organization called Immigrant Defense Project, and we had been tracking at the organization the ICE activity very closely in New York City. And the other thing that we had been working on is ensuring that immigrants were protected as much as possible from different types of surveillance technologies, because we were learning all the different ways that ICE was finding people, relying very much on these tech tools. And, you know, this ID NYC was something that advocates had worked with the city to initiate in 2014 at a time when, you know, following 9/11, the ID system, state issued IDs became very important for people to get access to buildings and such. And we had intended for it to be the most secure ID possible. We were able to, it wasn't a full victory, but the city was retaining the documents, the underlying documents, everyone who applied for this ID. And it was, you know, the large part, mostly undocumented people who had applied for this ID. And it was just at this time we had found out that the city was being sued by 2 Republican legislators to turn over all the underlying documents to the Department of Homeland Security, right? This was like the first year of Trump. And at the very same time, we found out through Twitter that the city was trying to digitize this ID. And what they were trying to put on the ID was a financial, like a debit card, a RFID chip, but also put all the health records on there for everyone who used city health services, tracking the shelter stays for unhoused people, also encouraging people to use it as their subway card, replacing the Metro card. And as we were raising these concerns, and I was talking to Matt, you know, we were thinking about, you know, smart cities and kind of this move towards increasing the legibility and visibility, but also how digital ID systems were often very exclusionary in terms of being, in addition to being a surveillance tool. So this is getting back to the book. You know, I was learning from Matt a lot about digital ID systems and how they were attempting to build them in places like Kenya and Jamaica and elsewhere. You know, the refugees, the Rohingya in Burma. And so that led us to a conversation on, you know, this is the type of thing that we know is going to proliferate throughout different cities. Yet, you know, as organizers, we have to put all the pieces together ourselves. So why don't we just create a toolkit? And that brought us to Coline. We were introduced to Coline. And, you know, then it became this book, thanks very much to Haymarket and all the contributors here on this call, but also who are not here today. And, you know, I just wanted to say from my political work and my trajectory from focusing on Department of Homeland Security and you know, this unbelievable apparatus that's been built up in the past 20 years to, you know, not just in the United States, but globally, I think it's just really critical to think about, you know, what we call the everywhere border, this notion that the surveillance technologies and kind of the logics of constructing different threats and legitimating this level of state violence is really what animates like the urgency behind this book, and also is the reason this book is very foundational to why I founded the Surveillance Resistance Lab, which I founded last year, to really build, nurture, and accumulate the power of organizing and resistance, both locally and transnationally, against the state violence and corporate power that these technologies fuel. So to take on the everywhere border. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that backstory. I just had a flashback, Mizue, to meeting you when you were in the thick of that work with the digital ID in New York City. I think it was at Riverside Church at like a community town hall meeting or something that we first connected, and I completely blanked on that origin. So one more question for the editors, and then we'll turn to some of the contributors. The book treats the fight against borders and its technological manifestations as a mosaic of intersecting struggles that have to be fought on multiple overlapping terrains. So I'm curious what you all learned from the many wonderful contributors about border resistance and abolition more broadly in its technology augmented form. Maybe now we could hear from Coline, then Matt, and then we'll switch gears a little bit.
Sure, thank you. So something I learned is that border resistance can't be fought at one frontier at a time. Something that we see in the case studies of the book, looking at them holistically, is that although some of these battles were won, these wins are very incomplete and the challenges are continuous. And also because the evolving nature of these technologies and the policies and laws means that victories can be short-lived because new challenges can emerge really fast. So what I learned is that although we need to celebrate these victories, at the very least, in order to keep animating and keep nurturing our movements, we also need to be vigilant and adaptable. And what we really need is more coordinated action, a global resistance, so to say, but we're still quite far away from that, in my opinion, and we also lack critical funding in many spaces. But the first step, which is something that we were trying to do with this and contribute to through this book, is to better understand each other's struggles across geographies, to see the linkages, and to put ourselves in a position to consolidate and to confront collectively. So that was my insight, and I'll pass it on to Matt.
Thanks, Coline. Yeah, I mean, there is so much to glean, and I've, through the multiple passes of the book, both in the production as well as now having it in our hands, I feel like I'm learning something new every time I go through it. But I think to be concise, I guess we're learning that abolition has to be exacted on multiple fronts, not just within our institutions, where rampant security industries, including tech companies, compel violent policies into existence with promises of sophisticated, slow killing machines to deal with surplus populations or extract value on their backs until there's no more left. Not just at our borders, where bodies are being sorted first, really for the first time into worthy and unworthy. That is to say, that's where it happens first. It is, after all, I think, not a far-fetched to think of the border as an extension of enclosure, to think about abolition in prisons, to think about abolition at our local authorities and our local communities, down to the seemingly innocuous lamppost that was just upgraded with smart capabilities, but also epistemically. And that's to say, how we talk about what we're fighting. It's not only borders, prisons, algorithms, classism, exploitation, racism, imperialism, occupation, apartheid. It's racial capitalism at large. And the contributors in this book together, I think, develop a common vernacular across various traditions of abolitionist activism and resistance, channeling these towards the same root force, which is to say technology-augmented racial capitalism, and the ways in which its entanglements with borderization perpetuates a sort of a conditions of global apartheid. We'll hear much more about that from the panelists, so I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you for setting the stage. And now to the main course, which is we have three of our wonderful contributors joining us from all different parts of the world. And so I want us to get started here with reflecting on each of your contributions to the volume. What about resisting borders and technologies of violence resonates for you? And why does resisting borders and their violent technology manifestations feel particularly urgent in this moment? Maybe we can start with Juan Carlos, then Ruthie, then Marwa.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. Also, thank you, Mizue, Matt, Coline, for the invitation to participate in the book. In the contribution that I added to this volume, the concern was about the deployment of technology for the purposes of control in the context of the pandemic internally. However, one of the central points of that work had to do with the centralization of data within the state through the usage of technologies that are developed or acquired from companies, which can be, in some cases, such as in this one, a locally developed product, but which also relied on infrastructure from the US. And that, of course, uses the internet and uses transborder data flows. However, that data centralization attempt at control of information during the pandemic had the purpose of, on the one hand, trying to promote the idea that the state was doing something with regards to the ongoing pandemic, whilst at the same time collect information about people's location, about people's whereabouts, about where they were, with no necessarily a good use or an attempted explanation of what it would be used for, but rather the idea that collecting more information would eventually lead to better health outcomes or better health measures from the government. And even though this might sound like something a bit more insular, I think one of the key factors in this type of deployments of technology is that it reflects and it resonates with the notion that we are facing states that are aiming to pursue their goals through technology, and those goals are not necessarily those linked to the welfare of the population. The context in which these technologies were deployed were not just those of the pandemic or a health crisis, but also one where we were months after a big social movement and huge social protests. Knowing where people are after and when ongoing protests are happening is not something that just favors healthcare measures, but rather the opacity of these processes and the way in which information is collected can help oppression and can help repression and can help to strike and stomp down social movements as well. When something like this appears, and when we see that the deployments of technology is also linked to a central factor here, which was the national ID system in my country here in Chile, that also links to the notion of the states knowing where each specific individual can be and not just the accumulation of them. And one thing that resonated strongly when I was visiting the volume and Ruja's introductory chapter was this idea of the border in the US in September 2021. When that happens in the US, here in Chile, in the other extreme of the Americas, we received news and pictures of people from Haitian origin, people from Haiti that were living in Chile. They were dropping their national ID cards that they obtained in Chile at the border. And we saw pictures of those. And we saw those names and those national ID cards that looked just like this and that involved a lot of personal information. And they were gathered because they were leaving out this type of centralization of information so they could go into the US to other forms of information management that would not necessarily reflect what their intentions were or what their necessities need at that moment. The urgency is marked by the notion that we are in a global crisis of the environment, that we will continue to see economic crisis moving people from one side to the other, and that we are going to continue othering people, othering those that come in from one place to another, or expelling them in some cases, and that is by itself something that motivates control. The technology companies and the state itself are constructing the framework that will allow for a more efficient control, and we need to prevent that from erasing the interest of the population itself.
Thank you.
I think it's my turn.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And I am not mute. Great. Hi. Thank you, Ruja. Thank you, editors. Thank you, co-panelists. Thank you, Haymarket. I'm very pleased to be here. It's my second webinar of the day, and there is consistency. The first one was about Lenin, imperialism, and the question of self-determination. And in the earlier conversation, we were talking quite a bit about how Lenin talked about how imperialism proceeds through the partition and repartition of territories. And the borders we're talking about today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, are those partitions, which also slice through individual bodies, as we've already heard from the editors and from Juan Carlos. So what most resonated with me in participating in this book, having Mizue twist my arm so that I would be in the book, and then reading and learning from the people who have written the book are two central things. The first, which I think Matt said earlier, I'm going to repeat, there are so many dimensions to the problems that we face, and that means we have nothing but opportunities for organizing. that every dimension involves contradiction, and every contradiction is an invitation to organize and to think about how to win. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that the sort of dual dynamics that seem to underlie how racial capitalism unfolds across the planet are the dimensions of organized abandonment and then organized violence. And that we can discuss, and we will discuss as we're together today, various aspects of organized abandonment, including direct war, and the fact that organized violence, the forces of organized violence, have successfully aggrandized themselves in close cooperation and mutual dependence with capitalist firms in the ways that you've all have already described. And that is what we face now. So it is not the whole state, even if some people in this conversation, I'm not one, are anarchists and think the whole state has to go. But it is the forces of organized violence have risen to positions of prominence, and their hunger for resources cannot be denied.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Marwa.
Thank you. Many thanks also for Coline, Mizue, and Matt for inviting me to contribute to this very important book. My chapter delved into the use of Israeli biometric surveillance technologies as a means to population and territory control. And there are two things that I wanted to emphasize in this chapter as part of border surveillance and technologies of violence. One is, digital systems, or no, actually ID systems. So the very exercise of identification as old as colonialism. It stems from British colonial rule based on the notion of rules by record. And we see this practice now, of course, being developed further in the case of Palestine. It has become an essential tool for settler colonialism. In order to control people and the territory they inhabit, you have to classify them. You have to collect every single information about them. And then you have to categorize them. And that's, what we see right now as a Palestinian. You have Palestinians that live in Israel that are citizens of Israel. They have a different ID. Palestinians that live in Jerusalem are residents of Israel, and they have a different ID. As a Palestinian from the West Bank, you have a green ID. These are all classified by color. And if you are a Palestinian from Gaza, you have a different category. And with each classification, you have different permissions. So you have different permissions to where you can exist and live and work as a Palestinian, and where you are not allowed to enter or trespass. And with that, those permissions comes physical violence. As in, if you are a Palestinian driving in the West Bank and you manage to come close to a checkpoint where you're not allowed to cross or come close to a settlement, the chances that you might be shot at are, is pretty high. And there are, of course, levels of violence that emanate from that I did not necessarily mention in the book. But now that I'm talking about this, something that comes to my mind is how, for instance, a global company like Google adopts these, the geography and the population control and offers services accordingly. So, Google assumes that you are an Israeli settler or an Israeli citizen. You can use the roads that are designated for those individuals only, which again, as a Palestinian, if you use Google Maps and you want to drive from one city to the other, you might find yourself on a road that is allowed for settlers only. And again, if you make that mistake, it can cost you your life dearly. And now, in this time and age, of course, biometric surveillance technologies come to facilitate and to automate these types of oppression. So it is you have these ID systems that become digitized to make the oppression more cost effective. And then there is the malicious argument in the context of Palestine by the Israeli authorities that those technologies come in order to help alleviate the pressure on Palestinians. So, when you use Qalandia checkpoint, for instance, and I've used that for years, and I can tell you it's a nightmare to come to the checkpoint. You don't know how many people are in front of you. It's used by thousands of people on a daily basis, and you can stand there for hours. And so they tell us, with these types of technologies, now we even have an app that you can request a permit from the Israeli military authorities, and that's for our own benefit and our own service. Now, the second point that I wanted to emphasize on is that what happens in Palestine doesn't stay in Palestine, and Israel has capitalized on its national security industry or in its homeland security industry, on its surveillance industries, in order to market those technologies to the rest of the world as field tested. And one of the examples that come to mind here is the Israeli company Anyvision. Now goes by the name Otso, OOTSO, that was first experimented in checkpoints. So the first upgrade we got from soldiers asking you for your ID to biometric identification and verification of your ID was done by this company. And this company sells its technologies in different parts of the world, at airports, different borders. Another example is, the technologies that Israel has deployed on the US-Mexico border. There are numerous examples where the violence and the oppression that came from these technologies has been replicated in different parts of the world, which, to echo what the editors had mentioned already on the call, it's really an interconnected struggle. And these technologies are transferred from one context to the other, and propagating further violence and racialization of people and communities.
Thank you, Marwa. And your comments remind us, one, of the kind of do-gooding ethos in which so many of these harms are wrapped, the kind of welfare rhetoric. And then to the point about the violence not staying in Palestine, one of the things that is coming to the forefront in the Stop Cop City organizing in Atlanta, again, is the role of the Israeli forces in training the Atlanta Police Department and thinking about those global connections. And so some would argue that a slow and steady approach to regulating these technologies to be more fair, unbiased, accountable is the way forward, a slow and steady approach. I wonder what each of you think in terms of this argument. Is this enough? Perhaps we can go in the same order that we just spoke, Juan Carlos, Ruthie, and then Marwa.
Well, of course, if I were a technology company, I would prefer the slowest possible attempted regulation, hopefully to give me as well time to both develop in technology that will cover all of my bases, but at the same time to also push for something that is more suitable to my business model, and hopefully also to establish and perpetuate my business model, so any attempted regulation can be too disruptive to come into place. So slow and steady might be useful in some fashion, but let's also take into account what this means for the development of technology. We already are in a moment in time where every time that we discuss any type of policy advocacy with regards to technology, we know that policy is coming too late. also in which we know that either at the nation state level or the international level, any attempt will also be very limited by the artificiousness of borders that will allow companies to just move around and shop their forums and stay where they can move away from enforcement action or any form of real accountability. And at the same time, because those same borders allow the companies to also shop products differently to different state clients. So those efforts of regulation need to be understood in the context of the inefficacy of those efforts themselves, and also the notion that state power does not necessarily serve the subjects, but in many cases other types of goals, including those of the national industries or the state's interest in security and maintaining its own borders and whichever goals they might set for themselves. I do understand, as someone who has been as an activist in doing policy advocacy for over a decade now, that being involved in national and international regulatory processes is important, and that will by its own nature be slow, if not necessarily steady, in places like Latin America. But at the same time, the regulation, the rules, the norms that conduct that carry or that allow companies and technologies to develop and states to be using them, and all those structures are not norms or rules that come necessarily from the democratic process or even from state authorities, but rather a mixture of the way in which they behave for the purposes of maintaining both sufficient isolation from accountability, but also close relations that will allow them to continue with their business. So in that sense, even though I would maintain that approach of slow and steady process as something that is part of many of our work, the urgency that the moment is presenting for us requires swifter action. So it's definitely not sufficient, but it's up to us as well to also go and do the rest of the work in the public forum, in academia, of course, with politicians, and even with the companies in whichever way is necessary or urgent. But the moment requires far more than just looking at the slow and steady path.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I have a couple of things I'd like to say. The first is to lift up the reference that Ruha's already made to the Cop City fight in Atlanta, Georgia, United States of America. And in court, in the last day or so, prosecutors have argued that people who have not smartphones, so I call them dumb phones, are, by the virtue of having them, showing their intent to commit crimes. Right. Wow. So, wow. This is the level at which we're.
Is it because they can't be tracked?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's precisely it. Precisely it. It's because they can't be tracked. And but continuing with the question of the urgency, I completely agree with Juan Carlos about how urgent the work is, and I am completely unconvinced there is any way to make any of this stuff fair, because, as you said in your introductory remarks, Ruha, what underlies this stuff is already organized according to the sedimentation of unfairness that then gets built upon with new levels of unfairness. Yeah. So, that said, in thinking about the temporality of the work we do, I don't think I said in my earlier remarks what my chapter was about, and that is an interview with Mizue, just talking about the sort of big picture of the rise of what we call mass incarceration in the United States and its relation to the criminalization of long-distance migrants and therefore the growth of migrant detention and deportation. All right. So the only way to fight this stuff is to fight at a variety of speeds at once. So building on the ground, as everybody knows, is really slow and painstaking, except for every so often when everyone explodes, whether it's the strikes against the change in transportation costs in Chile or the murder of George Floyd in the United States. But in between, people are doing all different kinds of things at once. And I think the key to us proceeding more effectively, I don't know about efficiently because this is politics we're talking about, but more effectively is by joining forces in as many different kinds of struggles as possible. Figuring that people in a number of different places are facing the same threats, are struggling against the same technologies or similar technologies. Or in the case of who trains whom, it is true enough that Israeli police have trained US police. It is also true that one of the purposes of Cop City is for it to become a training center for police around the world. So it's not like it ends with the transfer, but it begins with the transfer.
Thank you. Yeah, that idea of multiple fronts, but also variety of speeds is really useful because I think I'm used to thinking about the former, but the latter is a very helpful formulation as well. Marwa, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I have a few points to raise on the regulation aspect or how to tackle the proliferation of these technologies. One, I do agree that technologies move much, much faster at any attempt of regulation or policy. One example that we have all experienced and witnessed, regardless where we live, is the pandemic and the speed in which contact tracing apps and all sorts of tracking apps have been deployed at multiple levels, and once that infrastructure has been rolled out, it's really difficult to stop it or have like an ending to it. So it's often that the technologies are deployed, a status quo is created, and then we have to, and the harm is done and the violence is committed and perpetrated, and then we have to think of solutions. And therefore, I think also to the question of whether you can make technologies fair or unbiased. I mean, these words to me fit an ethical framework that we should be really wary of, because those are also fluid terms. Fair to who? Unbiased towards who? If you think about border surveillance, for instance. For a government like Israel or the Israeli regime, having border surveillance is important for the safety of their citizens. But that also means the violence and the oppression and the subjugation of Palestinians. And so I think some technologies are inherently incompatible with human rights. And that's the framework we need to look at. Even though recently I must admit that I've also become skeptical of that framework and its applicability, but that's another story. But again, it's some technologies, there's no way that you can make them fair. There's no way that you can make them equitable. Or accountable. Biometric surveillance is one of them. The erosion of people's ability and right to be anonymous, to protest, to use public spaces. Once the technologies are out there, good luck. That's it. That's the end of our freedom and liberties as we know it. And there's no way that you can use them in an unbiased or an accountable manner. And the last point I want to raise here is that we have to think of this as an industry. And again, emphasizing the global nature of these issues that we're grappling with. There are many companies, some we know, some we don't, that profit and are happy to supply these technologies for the governments that need them. And so you can, of course, tackle them at a country, at a community, one community at a time, one country at a time, where you also have to zoom out a bit and look at this industry as a whole and how it can be tackled. And there you need absolutely a global response to a global problem.
Point taken. And around that language of bias and fairness, as you say, if our main critique is only about the differential impact of these harms, then the solution becomes something like equal opportunity oppression. Like, let's all be oppressed equally versus let's get rid of the oppression to begin with. And so I'm with you on that wariness. And so in his comments earlier on, Matt mentioned this notion of racial capitalism as a lens or a framework, and in conversation with the work around tech-mediated harms. Can we talk a little bit about racial capitalism in tech production and state violence? How are you all thinking about this sort of nexus of issues? We can go in the same order, and if you perhaps don't necessarily have a comment on it, feel free to pass, and we'll go around again. Juan Carlos.
Sure, I'll speak very briefly on this point because it's not a central part of the work that we have been doing at Derechos Digitales, but something that necessarily is crossed whenever we discuss anything related to the developments of technologies and the framework of exploitation from countries here in the global majority, sometimes also spoken of as developing countries. In part because we see from this side what this global racial capitalist system means for the exploitation of labor, including for those that serve the technology industries, both those that operate internet services, but also those that create products like physical, tangible products. It also touches upon how we can be exploited by our labor and our data without necessarily being part of the benefits, the economic benefits of the development of those industries. It's also reflected in the way in which state violence already is manifested towards indigenous groups, Afro-descendant groups, migrant groups, but especially, and I think this is very important to understand how this is a continuum that develops over time. In many of our countries, both for energy and for natural resources, including mining, it's the exploitation of territories that are in the hands of indigenous communities or that are natural reserves, that many of these efforts of exploitation are brought to us in a way that becomes exploitative because we are understood as populations that matter less. This is extremely important in the case of the development of technologies that require rare earth materials and increasingly lithium, which is attempted to be mined in places like Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, where, as you might be aware, at one point Elon Musk was joking about a coup in Bolivia so they could mine their lithium. In part, this is just capitalism with no other names. However, the fact that these minerals are in the hands of populations which include indigenous populations, which include mixed race populations and racialized populations, that also means that it matters less that these are the people that are currently in control, and therefore that exploitation can come to them just as it comes for their labor or their data. So that's the only addition I would make to the point.
Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I forgot to mute myself. Sorry for all the background noise. I have a couple of things to say. The first is to remind all of us that when we say racial capitalism, we're not using that term as a shorthand for bad capitalism, against which there's good capitalism we would prefer. We're using racial capitalism to describe all of capitalism and to enforce in people's minds a particular dynamic within capitalism. It's also not a story of what white people do to people who are not white, right? There was a a drama here in Portugal, where I live, that brought down the government. The prime minister had to resign from his office because the government had entered into agreement with an extraction company, mineral extraction company, that was going to level a village in northern Portugal because it sits on a lithium mine. This is still racial capitalism because there's still a determination about whose lives matter.
Yeah.
All right. And the other thing I'd like to say at this point is, in echoing a point that Marwa made earlier, the enormity of forms that international productive, extractive, and financial institutions take in scouring the earth in their endless hunger for cash. Eventually, that is the point, because we're talking about capitalism, takes so many convoluted routes to arrive where it's going that, again, this gives us opportunities and challenges for fighting. And I'll give a very specific example. There is a very well-known firm called G-Force. Everybody's heard of G-Force, right? It used to be a UK firm. It's now a US-owned firm. It was bought in the US by a security services company based in Pennsylvania, and where they got the money to buy G-Force was from the Canada Public Workers Pension Fund. So we see so many resonances that have to do with what happens with deferred compensation. It turns into private ability to police people around the world. That's what happens. What happens here happens there, and so forth. So these are some aspects of racial capitalism we must take very seriously as we figure out what to do.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like I'm back in your class 20 years ago. I love it. I love it. Taking notes. No test this time. Marwa, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this particular question?
Yeah, very quickly. I think for me, the context of occupied Palestine, military occupation, apartheid, and oppression has turned into a profitable business. And as I said, Israel does not only suffice in subjugating or deploying these technologies to subjugate the Palestinian population it occupies, but also turning these technologies into a profitable business. And there are a number of examples that we can discuss and share, but one that shows the nature of this transfer of technologies and skills, not only in training cops, but also, if you look at the US-Mexico border, some of the technologies used there are these Hermes drones, there's unmanned aerial vehicles that Israel has first tested in its wars on Gaza and continue to use in Gaza. And according to some estimates, 60% of the drone sale around the world come from Israel. The same can be said around surveillance technologies and spyware and all sorts of malicious technologies that invade people's privacy and undermine human rights and facilitate abuses worldwide. Israel is a top exporter of these technologies, and there is a reason for that. And it's important for me it's important for us to interrogate the supply chain. Often people want to tackle the end use of that technology, where it is deployed, but we have to also look at where it emanates from and what types of abuses that led to the creation of these technologies. Israel treats Palestinians, as they have said it, as human animals. They have no rights whatsoever in the system of apartheid. We don't have any control or say in any types of technologies or rules that the Israelis enforce on us. You can have a roadblock. You can wake up one day and find a roadblock on the entrance of your village or your city. The next day, it can be a biometric upgraded checkpoint. Really, like, you have no option but to face that reality, and therefore, they can, of course, deploy this context to their advantage, and again, use Palestine as a laboratory for the prototyping and then the export of such technology. So that's however you want to describe it, racial or not, it's capitalism at its very core.
And with the supply chain, it reminds me of an insight that Ruthie often imparts, that we need to follow the money and think about not just who's harmed, but who's benefiting seemingly from these investments. And so this is an important segue now to acknowledge that we're having this launch at a time when hope and resistance is being disciplined and challenged every day. It's hardly possible to talk about borders, techno-racial experimentation, racial capitalism, and imperialism without thinking about the Palestinian struggle. So my last question, and then we'll segue to audience questions, is what are the links, in your view, between border enforcement, technology production, and experimentation and apartheid in Palestine? And Marwa has got us thinking about this. So maybe we can go to Juan Carlos and then Ruthie. And Marwa, if you have anything else to add, feel free also at the end.
Sure, absolutely. And this is also a moment to send again my deepest desires and wishes for the liberation of Palestine, especially at this moment, but as a moment here, also to reflect on what this history has been. I live in Chile, one of the countries with the largest amount of people of Palestinian descent that has left Palestine throughout the last over 150 years. At the same time, this is a country in which the country itself continues to buy technology and weapons from Israel, including technologies for surveillance, including balloons of surveillance that were installed in the richest part of the city that I live in Santiago, that we presented legal action against and eventually lost, which were with the purposes of surveilling for security. This shows by itself that these technologies and the things that Marwa was mentioning are parts of what a continuum of violence shows from its supply chain to its end user and throughout. The enforcement of borders, of course, keeps relying on technology, and the migrant pressures will probably insist on that. But the experimentation that you can see also in Palestine then becomes the technology that is going to be used for the othering here in other places. Those technologies are tested and refined in the context of the occupation and to maintain control over Palestine, but that also leads to the normalization of those technologies for day-to-day usage in the checkpoints, but also in the constant surveillance. And the notion that that leads to somehow enhanced security is also something that speaks to many of the pressures that countries are suffering during this time of uncertainty. So those oppressive systems intersect. There's an industry that is growing in Israel that also has many client states in the rest of the world and in many places in the majority world, and not just the richest countries, but also those that wish to have a technological edge to their security efforts, and that is being already used against human population in Palestine. At the same time, we also know that there is room for resistance and for solidarity in that resistance, because we have seen that resistance in Palestine and because we have seen the solidarity as well. And I hope that as much as that story and that moment can be very difficult to understand and very difficult to follow, at the same time that there is an opportunity for that solidarity today.
Thank you. Ruthie.
Okay, I'll just say a few things. The level of experimentation is so intense. It is mass murder, as we know. It is genocide, which is not identical to mass murder. It is destroying a people as well as killing many, many, many humans, both things. And the experimentation is being carried out both with these incredibly sophisticated, expensive, technological things, those things that can make war seem very abstract because the work of killing people is carried out with a minimum use of muscle and brain. That's what bombs do. That's what guns do. That's what drones do. Minimize muscle and brain, maximize killing. And there's other kinds of experimentation going on at the same time that's older forms of technology. And this goes back to something we discussed at the beginning of our webinar. So that includes, I keep trying to remember not to swear. It includes messing with people's diets, making them hungry, destroying the land as well as the houses and schools and everything where people lived, and poisoning the earth by pumping seawater into the tunnels. These are all experiments, old-fashioned, as well as more contemporary technologies to destroy people. And I say all of these grim things because, again, this shows us all the different ways that people already do and people who haven't must be organized over issues related to water, which relates to climate as well as war, issues related to the fecundity of earth, which is related also to the well-being of people.
I'll go next. Yeah, I think before I get into the subject matter, I hope for all of our audiences to know that Israel is, not that far from invading Rafah, which is would be the final act of its genocide in Gaza, where the majority of Palestinians are currently taking shelter, and the fear of forced displacement is real. It gives us all existential anxiety, because we know that would be our second Nakba, our second catastrophe, where we're displaced and Gaza is decimated beyond any recognition, and there is no way for people to go back. So that would be the end of Gaza as we know it. The fear is real, so it's more important than ever that people mobilize and continue to call for a ceasefire and pressure their governments that have been genocide accomplices to stop the fighting, to stop the military aid that enables the deployment and the luxury, actually, of Israel to experiment to the extent it can with Palestinian lives. Now, more specifically to the question, the Gaza Strip in itself is really an interesting microcosm, a disturbing one, that again, highlights all the issues that we're talking about and technologies of violence. In 2021, the Israeli authorities, the military, were so proud of calling their war as the first artificial intelligence war. And we see now, I'm sure everyone have seen the investigation that unearthed what the Israeli military are using at the moment with their AI-powered gospel system that spits out hundreds of targets for the Israeli military every day and processes an enormous amounts of data that requires tens of thousands of intelligence officers to process. Hundreds of targets on a daily basis, pretty much since October 7th, Israel has been killing at least 100, 200 Palestinians a day. And 70% of those are killed are women and children. And so they, the military can say all at once about precision of targets, that they're only going after Hamas, which we all know is just an excuse to enact the forced displacement and the ethnic cleansing in Gaza. But around the border and even before October 7th, there's been a plethora of technologies that Israel used. We have like unmanned aerial vehicles, and I mentioned the Hermes as one of those technologies manufactured by El Beit Systems, an Israeli company. They've used these kamikaze drones or suicide drones. We've seen now during the war really dystopian, almost nightmare-like videos of quadcopters used to snipe and gun down doctors, nurses inside of hospitals, or quadcopters going after Palestinian journalists hovering outside of their homes that are ready to just shoot their targets. We've also seen robo snipers. Also, Israel has used those robo snipers around the border to create so-called a kill zone and automated kill zones that are 1 kilometer deep. They've also used what they call a Jaguar unmanned ground vehicle, which is a semi-autonomous military robot that Israel also calls one of the first military robots in the world that can substitute soldiers on the borders. And ironically, before the Hamas attack on October 7th, Israel had taken the head of the NATO military committee on a tour around the Gaza border to show the importance of high technology for manning borders. Again, going as to demonstrate the point around how Palestine and Gaza has been used as an experimentation lab, and the epitome of that we see now, whether it be through the gospel or playing with people's lives with these ridiculous QR codes and cutting the Gaza Strip, which is already so tiny, like to 600 small blocks, and asking people to move around from one block to the other, where we know, as a matter of fact, that there is literally nowhere safe in the Gaza Strip. For me, it's just the embodiment of how evil technologies can be. And to your point earlier, Ruth, that there is no neutral technology. Those are technologies that are designed in certain contexts for certain purposes. And it's really hard to disassociate these technologies from the environments they've been created in and the purposes they have been deployed for.
Thank you, Marwa, for that. We now have a couple questions from the audience. Thank you so much, everyone who stuck with us for the last hour and 20 minutes. I am going to read out the first question. This audience member says, I'm curious to hear how the panelists and editors think that these trends and technologies that you're discussing are likely to develop as the climate crisis and its pressure on borders deepens. And so if I could just ask perhaps Coline and then Mizue to reflect on this with us.
Thank you. So this weekend, there's the Munich Security Conference happening, and ahead of this conference, they published an index, which came out earlier this week, which surveys some of the major perceived risks in major countries. And in Europe, they found that European voters are increasingly worried about migration because of climate change and war. And this, of course, doesn't come as a surprise, but it's worth highlighting because it's very much part of the problem. Because by positioning climate change as a threat, this not only increases pressure on borders, but it also creates a narrative that is used and weaponized to stir fear, and that is weaponized by institutions to justify militarist responses to these threats, which includes the deployment of hostile technologies and also responses of violence instead of responses of protection, which, that should be the natural response. And for example, there's a recent report by Lighthouse Reports that showed how Frontex, the muscle of the European, of the Fortress Europe, was giving away locations of migrant boats to Libyan coast guards over 2,000 times in the course of 3 years, while also watching videos and knowing that these migrants are being whipped, beaten, and shot by the same coast guards. So I think as the climate crisis unfolds, and we are going to see a stark rise in climate migration, we really need to remind ourselves that borders, they reinforce, intensify, and reproduce violence, and they do not keep us safe or secure. And I think that's also something we hope to make clear in this book.
Thank you for the question. I just wanted to point to a couple chapters in this book, Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. Arun Kundanani's piece on abolished national security talks about how the U.S. national security infrastructure has been a major contributor to the climate crisis. And he says, indeed, rather than reducing its carbon emissions, the Pentagon presented the climate crisis as providing a new rationale for its existence, declaring the U.S. military as a necessary source of order in a world of climate-driven mass migration and extremism. And then in another chapter by Joseph Nevins and Todd Miller, Empire's Walls, Global Apartheid and Infrastructure, kind of guiding us to what the function of borders is, right, to reinforce kind of global inequality and create a precarity among people that capitalism, racial capitalism, needs to exploit. It also points us to the fact that the biggest predicator of who constructs physical walls and where they do so, for instance, is the wealth gap between the nation state constructing the barrier and the place and population defined as a threat. And also, it is those very countries that are building the walls that are the greatest producers of the emissions that has created and continues to fuel this crisis. And so just, a plug for this book. This is why we're here. But I also wanted to just add to the point that Ruthie raised a very important point around Cop City and kind of the weaponizing of the smartphone as a digital tracking advice, right? Or some way, even if it's not on. And, really one of the things that we're confronting is like this forced dependency and a forced consent, right, on these devices that, we have to admit are huge fuelers of climate, of consumption, right, of fossil fuels, the energy that it takes to produce them and to keep the internet running, but also the ongoing conquest. You talked, Juan Carlos, about kind of the mining that's associated with these phones, the land occupation, right, and extraction and the exploitation that happens. But, one of the things to this point of slow technology encroachment, one of the things that we're confronting in the United States is we're a little bit slow on the national ID game. A lot of countries outside the United States, as you'll read in this book, have already adopted them, but they have proven to be very effective tools of tracking and exclusion and surveillance. And, the Department of Homeland Security, along with other states and corporations, are very actively fueling the proliferation of mobile driver's licenses being adopted within the United States. And, it's, can you imagine like when you get pulled over or stopped on the street by a cop being like, give me your phone, right? And so I think, part of this idea in terms of the legibility that digital IDs and kind of these surveillance technologies give populations to police and corporations is really something that we have to really challenge, but think about too in terms of this point, as I said, about like forced consent and the dependencies we develop.
Thank you for that. I see that first quote that you read from the volume, this idea that those who create the problem then present themselves as the solution, reminds me of, I think, a call for proposals I read a few years ago from the Department of Defense for kind of green military technologies. And so one of the initiatives was bullets that when they're shot will fertilize the soil, right? And so it's this really absurdist positioning of, let's create more and more fixes rather than root causes. And to the point about consent, if someone could look up this Building Consentful Technologies initiative, that's easily downloadable to drop in the YouTube chat on that other end. I think that also speaks to this idea of the smartphone and building into the design the value of consent in that process. So I think we have time for one last question from the audience. Here we hear the policy regulation dimension that we've talked about is very important, but what about the way that the dismantling of public services or even whole wings of the state, thinking about SpaceX taking over NASA funding, has been funneled into private hands? Is this privatization itself a technology of violence we should be fighting? Maybe Matt, you could address that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ruha. I'm gonna commit to not going on a rant about Elon Musk. Technology is policy, and policy is ideology. And it's not an accident that technologies we've been discussing at large today emerge in the context of either self-appointed bastions of Western liberal democracies, which necessitate sort of strong laissez-faire capitalism, or sort of by unapologetically authoritarian contexts. In both instances, however, they're framed as being for security, for convenience, and for efficiency. So to address the question, yes, the technology capture of government function undergirded by what many scholars of neoliberalism have referred to as a hollowing out of the state is something that we could talk about, but I would argue that this assumes that the state wasn't always superficially ethno-racial or an attempt at lifting some people up above others and thinning services out for, again, surplus populations, and that the state didn't go hand in hand with the development of capitalism and racial capitalism moving into this century as well. And so I think we have to think about how, with the possibility of these policy interventions being lifted out from their until now hypernormalization by activists, by scholars who are talking about them at large, comes also the possibility of recapture, reclamation, thinking up something new. And if a noxious private entity can capture our imaginations, and I think this is what this is actually about, and Ruha talks about this a lot more, both in Viral Justice and also we'll be talking about this in the forthcoming book, which was just launched, actually not forthcoming anymore. But yeah, if it can capture our imaginations and replace functions we had previously in trusted states, why couldn't we do the same, right? Why couldn't we offer alternatives at the community level, which serve the community in the way a state and private companies never could? So in Viral Justice, which I will always continue to plug, one phrase that has been etched in my mind since I picked it up for the first time is hands to plow, where's your plot? That's to say, we all have a plot to plow that renders the possibility of a different world using the tools we already have at hand. So, tear down that smart lamp and in front of your home and farm your pavement patch to provide a healthy produce for the community. Block company headquarters and shipping ports from exporting technology of violence with human chains. Walk out of your classrooms and refuse your university's complicity in genocide. Set up your own community network. Set up a cooperative. There are so many options to which people are building power in smaller ways to serve their immediate communities, which if we scale it out through the Viral Justice formula, as it were, thinking about our organizing in a bioorganic format, I think there's a lot more that we can accomplish that, again, tech companies have been onto for a little while, but that we can usurp them from in some ways. But yeah, apologies, that was a very lengthy monologue.
Not at all, thank you. And really, it's a corollary to something that Ruthie said earlier on in the conversation, and perhaps this is where we can end, which is that we have ever expanding ways in which racial capitalism is imparting oppression, and therefore an ever expanding number of ways to resist and organize. So multiple fronts, variety of speeds. Get your copy of Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. Share it with friends. Post the cover where you can. share this video. The recording will be available, I think, almost immediately. And let's join together and thank Haymarket, thank the editors and contributors of this volume. And I appreciate everyone logging in today to join us for this conversation.